Well, folks, welcome to Study Hall. If it's your first time here, my name is Philip Godfrey. If you're returning, welcome back, Bible Study family. And so today we're going to be continuing our From Creation to Revelation study series where we started this year and walked through the entirety of the Bible, book by book, this calendar year. If you want to catch any of the previous studies, they'll be up on my page in a playlist entitled From Creation to Revelation. And so today, as part of our study, we'll be looking at 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. All right, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. But before I get started, I want to make sure I lay the foundation. Weekly Study Hall is a Bible study that's built off of the scriptures in Matthew 6:33, where the Messiah tells us to seek ye first the kingdom of the Father and his righteousness, and all things shall be added unto you. So we gather to do just that, to see, seek, and serve the kingdom of the Father. So thankful that you all have joined us. All right. Let's go ahead and jump in to First Thessalonians. First Thessalonians. And as you know, if you've been following this study, we've been working our way through the letters that Paul wrote to the churches in the region, the churches that were being spread and expanded throughout the region. And so here we have a letter from Paul to the believers in Thessalonica. All right, Thessalonica. So Thessalonica is a Roman city or a city in the Roman province, but it had, from my understanding, it had its own kind of leadership structure. So even though it was like under Roman kind of rule, it still had this like own kind of government and operating structure. But these are the same people from the book of Acts, all right, from the book of Acts that kicked out Paul and Silas and Timothy, or Paul and his friends who came to preach to the people. These are the same group. This is the same city that he was in before he went to the Berea and was removed from Berea as well by the Jews that were opposing him here in Thessalonica, and also had come over to Berea as well. And so Paul here is writing to these believers and encouraging them as it relates to the things of death, as it relates to the coming of the Messiah. He wants to encourage them in their persecution, in light of the persecution that they are experiencing. And he also wants to challenge them to be responsible for their salvation. And we'll expand on these themes as we move throughout the chapter, throughout the book. Let's go ahead and jump into chapter 1. So the book begins, like many of Paul's letters, by him first identifying himself as the author. Here he notes that Silas and Timothy are with him as well, and they are in agreement as he is writing to the believers here in Thessalonica. And he goes on to say that he's writing to these believers and giving thanks as he remembers their faith, their love, and their patience in the hope of the Messiah. So he's recounting, even though he dealt with some challenges in Thessalonica due to the Jews that were there, he's acknowledging that the believers that were there were willing, they were ready, they were available, and they were receptive, and have been even after his departure, to the things and continuing to walk in the things of the Father. He tells them how he remembers that the message of the gospel, the message of the Messiah, had came to them in power. That Paul himself and his team, they came to demonstrate this power and the message of the Messiah to them, to the people of that region. And because of that, they became believers. And not only believers, but they became examples for believers in other areas. Paul notes as Macedonia and Achaia, and believers throughout that entire region. So here we have the believers in Thessalonica, that Paul is commending them and stating, and basically saying thank you for living your life this way, because all the believers are looking to you as an example, all these believers from this region. He goes on to say that they heard this message. What was different about them is that they heard the message. They turned from their idols to serve the living and true Father, and to wait for his Son, the Messiah, who had delivered them from the wrath to come. And we see here that this is the theme that Paul is writing to address. He's writing and to kind of combat some of the beliefs, and even maybe some of the small teachings that had come up in that time, where there were people that were dying, and they were kind of struggling to really understand what that meant, and what eternal life meant, and what death looked like in the Messiah, and in belief in this message that they had received. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. As we move into chapter 2, Paul goes on to affirm that he, Silas, and Timothy, that they didn't come to him in vain. So again, we've seen this in the last few of Paul's letters, but he's really writing and kind of like acknowledge, or I trying to make sure that everyone understands that his intentions are pure. that he has the right intentions and motives, because there are those who do not have those intentions and motives that are operating in close proximity of these believers. And we see him doing this here. He's talking about how him and his team, they didn't come to them for no reason, that they desired to come to them and to share the message of the Messiah with them, even after everything they had gone through getting to that place, getting to Thessalonica. He says that they came to them without deceiving them, without bringing uncleanness to them, and without having any deceit or guile. That they taught them the message in truth. They taught them the trust in the message. They didn't come to please them. They didn't come to please themselves. They didn't come to please the people, but they came and spoke and taught them to please the Father. They weren't there seeking their own glory. They're seeking to burden the believers there. No, they came and desired, and they came to them and desired to come to them in a gentle manner, in a loving manner, to nurse them as a mother, essentially as a mother does to her children. Does that make sense? So Paul is saying we came with love to bring you this message. We came with intentionality to bring you this message, not to place any weird burdens on you or to burden you in any type of way. He then goes on to challenge them with this in mind, because they brought them this message in that way. He challenges them to walk worthy of the Father and of his kingdom and his glory. He commends them for receiving this message from him as truth, even though they are dealing with religious leaders, the Jewish people at the time. They're dealing with those religious leaders in that region opposing the teaching and also opposing the church continually. So when they kicked Paul out of Thessalonica and Berea, the Jewish leaders didn't stop messing with the people. They kicked Paul out, they kicked him out, and then they continued to oppose and speak against and even teach against what the Paul had planted there as the church and the belief system that he had left there with them. So in the short time, Paul acknowledges that the short time that they were with them, that they were brought, these believers in Thessalonica were brought into the body as believers and followers of the Father. And they accepting the message is their glory, is Paul and his team's their glory and honor and joy, not honor. It's their glory and joy that they're not doing these things for themselves. They're finding glory and joy in the changed lives and the manifest fruit from these believers. Hopefully everybody hears what the Spirit is speaking. So in chapter 3, we see Paul talks about how he sent Timothy back to the believers there to teach them and strengthen them regarding the faith, especially as they are navigating afflictions and tribulation, just like Paul and his team have. But Timothy returned. He said he sent Timothy. Timothy came to him, and Timothy returned and gave Paul a fantastic report of the believers there regarding their faith, talking about how strong their faith was, how much they loved people, how much they continued to care for Paul and his team and love them. And this report comforted Paul, he says, in the challenges that he was navigating in that season. And now he is praying, as we see in chapter 3, that the Father will allow him to come and see them in Thessalonica once again. The chapter closes with Paul's prayer that the Father would increase the believers in Thessalonica, and that they would abound in love toward each other and all men. He's saying, hey, I still want you, the message of the Messiah still requires that you love even those Jews that are oppressing you, those people that are oppressing you. And he prays that the Father would establish them in holiness. In holiness, this is our alignment and walking with the Father, holiness before the return of the Messiah. Because if you're not holy when the Messiah returns, it's going to be a tough day for you. In chapter 4, we see Paul, he reminds the believers of the things that were taught to them by him and his friends or his ministry partners. They taught them these things so that they would continue to grow and increase, instructing them to stay away from fornication, to walk in sanctification and honor instead, to flee from lust, to flee from fraud, because the Father opposes those who do those things. But their focus should be on giving themselves over to holiness. We see that word here again, holiness, the alignment and obedience to the instructions and expectations of the Father. And with all of that, to have love for all brethren and believers everywhere, to study, to be quiet, to do their own business, work with their own hands, so that they can walk honestly towards them who don't believe and lack nothing in the process. The chapter ends with Paul sharing with them regarding those who have died. He tells them, like, hey, he doesn't want them to be ignorant regarding them, those who have died, or sorrowful of those who have died, like those who are living without the promise of eternal life. Because if the Messiah died and rose again, that those who sleep in the Messiah, the Father will also bring with him as well when Messiah comes back to the Father, or comes to receive the people and comes back to heaven again. That all that all the dead and the living in that day will be called up to the Messiah in the heavens. So Paul is comforting them and saying, hey, even though these people who you love are no longer here, if you, as believers and as they are believers, then you have the hope, and you're not living in, so you don't have to live in sorrow and grief in the way that the world does, because there is an eternal hope that not only will you, the Father, bring you with the Messiah up to heaven, but he will also bring those that have gone ahead as well as part of that process. This teaching continues into chapter 5, where Paul tells them that the day of the Messiah's return will come as a thief in the night, or like birth pains upon a pregnant woman. But he says that people will be saying peace and safety, and suddenly it will come. So it's going to be normal. Folks are going to be saying, hey, don't worry about that. That's not important, yada, yada. But as children of the light, they and we should not be sleeping or unaware at these seasons, at these times. We should be watching. We should be preparing and waiting for this day, the Messiah's return, by walking. And well, how do we wait? Let me slow down. How do we wait for this day? We walk in love, according to Paul. We walk in faith and the hope of salvation, because we've obtained salvation through the Messiah and we've not obtained wrath. Does that make sense? And because of that, we will live, because we obtain salvation through the Messiah, we will live with the Messiah where he lives, which is in heaven. He goes on to give them more instructions. He tells them to honor the leaders that the Father set over them, to be patient with people, to not repay evil for evil, to rejoice always, to rejoice. Remember, we looked at that in the previous study, to choose joy repeatedly. Always pray without ceasing, give thanks in everything, quench not the spirit, and don't despise prophecies, but hold fast to what is good and abstain from all appearance. Now, this is a high end level here, because like, at first it was like, hey, just stay away from evil. But it's like, stay away from anything that appears or even looks like it could be evil. And as they do this, Paul encourages them that the Father of peace will sanctify them and preserve them until the coming of the Messiah, because he is faithful. It's not about what we do. It's the fact that the Messiah and the Father, that they are faithful, or that he is faithful. Paul ends the letter, the first letter of 1 Thessalonians, by asking the believers there to pray for him, and ask that this letter would be read, that they would read this letter to all the believers that are there in that region. All right. So that's 1 Thessalonians. Let me know down in the comments what stood out to you as we move into 2 Thessalonians. All right. So again, 2 Thessalonians is another letter from Paul, writing again to the believers in Thessalonica. And so historians believe that this letter was written shortly, not too long after the first installment was written. But this letter here, 2 Thessalonians, focuses on Paul sharing with the believers how he has continued to boast about them. And then he goes on to address their theology surrounding the coming of the Messiah. What had happened was they had been led to believe that the Messiah had already returned and gathered all of his believers, and the fact that they were experiencing persecution at that time, they had been taught that was confirmation that the Father had removed his people, gathered his people, and the Messiah had gathered his people and had already returned. Paul is writing to correct and address this false teaching. So what happened here, and we'll see it in chapter 2, I believe. But what happened here is that someone had written a letter. We see Paul writes letters, right? So someone had written a letter as if it came from Paul and taught these false things in that letter. So what we see here is that there has even been, from the very beginnings, that there have been very subtle ways to try to infiltrate the believership and infiltrate the belief systems of the Father's people. Because if you are writing a letter as if you are Paul, because you know that Paul writes letters to to the believers, that shows that there is an intentional and coordinated copycat attack that is out there trying to reach the people. So that's something that we should be aware of and could still be happening today. But yeah, let's jump into chapter 1, 2 Thessalonians. Again, the letter here, the book Begins with Paul identifying himself as the author and noting that Silas and Timothy are there with him in agreement as well as he writes to the believers in Thessalonica. He goes on again to praise them by giving thanksgiving to the Father for them, that their faith and love continue to grow and abound. They were operating in abundance in that in this fruit. He goes on to let them know that they are encouraging all the churches through how they are living their life with patience and faith, even in the face of the persecutions and tribulations that they are currently enduring. Paul goes on with that in mind, goes on to let them know that the Father will recompense the tribulation that others are placing on them, that the Father will recompense these things upon them. As the chapter ends, we see Paul clarifying some things. Oh, as chapter 2 begins, As chapter 2 begins, we see Paul clarifying some things regarding the coming of the Messiah and the gathering together to him. In verse 2 is where we see he mentions that they had received a letter that seemed like it had come from them, but was not. He teaches them that before the Messiah comes, so they had been taught that the Messiah had come. So now Paul is teaching them what things must happen before the Messiah comes. And so he says that first there will be a falling away. There'll be a falling away. And then the man of sin will be revealed. That man of sin will then exalt himself above the things called God and sit as God in the temple of God. That's what the text says, what the scripture says. He lets them know that this lawlessness is already at work now secretly. That there is the spirit of the Antichrist, that the spirit of the Antichrist is already running throughout throughout society now and throughout the earth now, and it's doing that kind of secretly. Today is getting a little bit more bolder, but anyway, at Paul times it was doing it more secretly. But until that is happening until the time comes, until that set time comes for the man of lawlessness to be revealed, who is this same man of sin. That this man, the man of sin, will do the work of Satan, even by performing lying signs and wonders, deceiving those who do not love the truth unto salvation. So what does this mean? If we desire to not be deceived, what does the text tell us to do here? What can we infer? That we need to love the truth unto salvation, because he said he deceives those who do not love the truth unto salvation. That our salvation is found in the truth, which is what? The word and the message of the Messiah. Does that make sense? And all those who don't do this will inherit a strong delusion that has come from the Father, according to the text, and they will believe the lie and be damned. But Paul tells them that as believers, the Father has already chosen them not to fall and not to be damned and not to believe the lie. No, but he's chosen them from the beginning, believers from the beginning, to obtain the glory of the Messiah. And that as believers, they should stand fast, hold to the teachings of the word that are shared with them by true teachers. And the Father will comfort them and establish them if they do that. The book goes on to end in chapter 3 with Paul first asking the believers there to pray for him, that the Father would continue to deliver the message of the Messiah through them, Paul and his team, and that they will be delivered from the opposition and wicked men who don't have faith that were coming against them. He goes on to state that they are confident, Paul is confident, and his team are confident that the believers there in Thessalonica will actually do the things that they've instructed them in. He encourages them not to keep company with those who do not follow the teachings that they've given them. So Paul is saying, don't even kick it with folks who don't follow the scriptures. That's what Paul told them. I'm just telling you what Paul said. Don't follow the teachings that they've given them, because these people are an enemy, not a brother. He goes on to tell them to not be busybodies, but to work and eat their own bread, and to not be weary in well-doing. Before closing and affirming the letter, that he wrote the letter with his own hand, he petitions the Thessalonians, that the Father would continue to be with them and give them, he petitions the Father on behalf of the Thessalonians, that the Father would continue to be with them and give them peace and grace. And that is how he closes this second installment, this second letter to the Thessalonians. All right. And so that's what I got for us today. Hopefully you all got something from our look at First and Second Thessalonians. If anything stood out to you, please share those things with me, with us down in the comments. On our next study, we're looking at First and Second Timothy. So go ahead and prepare for that. I love you, but more importantly than that, the Father loves you. Okay, let Him love you. Start before you're ready, and don't stop. I'll see you guys next time.